Nothing, and I mean nothing like this, has ever been found in Petra.
Oh my god.
What is it?
Skeletons.
Skeletons!
Yes.
For nearly 2,000 years, a hidden chamber lay directly beneath one of the most famous ancient monuments on Earth. Nobody knew it was there. There were no records of it. No inscriptions marked its entrance. Then, in 2024, archaeologists finally opened the sealed chamber hidden beneath Petra's famous treasury, and what they found left them in shock. They had expected this chamber to be filled with gold, jewelry, and other precious artifacts. Instead, when they stepped inside, it looked less like a treasury and more like a burial chamber frozen in time. So, what exactly did archaeologists find inside that chamber? And how could this forgotten discovery change everything we thought we knew about Petra? The City of Tombs. Petra is a city that was carved into the desert cliffs of southern Jordan more than 2,000 years ago. It was built by the Nabateans, an ancient Arab trading civilization that was skilled enough to carve entire temples, tombs, and palaces directly out of solid rock. They didn't build these structures from the ground up the way most cities do. They cut them into the mountain itself. Every cut, every stroke was permanent. There was no room for a mistake. What they carved stayed carved forever. And yet, despite the difficulty of building in solid rock, the Nabateans didn't create a small settlement. They created a city large enough to support tens of thousands of people. That was possible because Petra had become one of the most important trading centers of the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh came up from southern Arabia. Spices and silk arrived from as far away as India. Petra sat at the crossing point of routes linking 3 continents, turning the city into a commercial powerhouse. But walk through the city today, and one thing stands out immediately. Almost none of the surviving buildings were homes. Nearly everything that is still standing is a tomb. And that tells us something important about the people who built Petra. In Nabatean culture, the dead never simply disappeared from everyday life. Families could gather in spaces connected to burial chambers, allowing the living to dine and remember their relatives alongside the places where they were buried. Nowhere is that relationship with the dead more visually striking than at Petra's most famous monument, the Treasury. This gigantic monument that towers over the entire city is also a tomb. Its enormous facade is carved directly into the face of the cliff. But to reach the treasury, you have to walk through a narrow, twisting canyon that suddenly opens up to reveal the full face of the treasury in one breathtaking moment. For more than 2 centuries, archaeologists have debated what the treasury actually was: a royal tomb, a temple, possibly both, depending on the period. Nowhere on its surface is there a single inscription explaining it, which is strange for a monument this important, since nearly every other major Nabatean structure was labeled with names and dedications. But the biggest mystery wasn't written on the walls at all. It was beneath the ground. For decades, local Bedouin guides had mentioned something that experts mostly shrugged off. In certain places near the treasury, the ground sounded different when tapped, hollow. For years, it remained nothing more than an intriguing local observation, until researchers finally brought the technology needed to find out what was actually underneath the surface. What the radar found. That technology finally arrived at Petra in early 2024. A joint team from the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, the American Center of Research, and the University of St. Andrews in Scotland was given rare permission to survey the ground directly around and beneath the treasury. Petra is a UNESCO heritage site, and the treasury is one of the most protected monuments in the entire archaeological complex. Getting the permit to carry out research directly on the site was extraordinary. Geophysicist Richard Bates led the scanning team, and he also admitted that he was genuinely surprised Jordanian authorities had agreed to let them carry out the tests at all. Keeping in mind how sensitive the site was, the team was going to use ground-penetrating radar. This is a non-invasive technology. By using this, the researchers made sure the site would not be harmed. Ground-penetrating radar sends radio waves beneath the surface and reads the signals coming back. Solid rock produces one kind of response. Empty space produces another. They ran the tests, and when the first results came back, the researchers were genuinely surprised. What the researchers saw left them stunned. An empty space where solid rock should have been. The space was big, clearly defined, and sitting almost exactly where local guides had spent years saying the ground sounded hollow, and that was enough to change the entire investigation. Suddenly, something that had been dismissed as local folklore had a very different meaning. The question was no longer whether the ground sounded hollow. The question was what had been carved into it. And there was another reason the researchers took the discovery very seriously. Archaeologists had already uncovered two smaller tombs on the left side of the Treasury. Those two tombs had raised an obvious question. If chambers had already been hidden around the Treasury, what else could still be buried nearby? In fact, that question had started this whole research with the ground-penetrating radar. For years, archaeologists had suspected there were more hidden tombs. Now, for the first time, they had evidence that they might be right. But finding a possible chamber was one thing. Getting inside it was another. The researchers couldn't simply start cutting into the courtyard to reach whatever was underneath it. That could cause damage to the Treasury itself. Even the radar survey had required approval because the authorities wanted to be certain that the process would cause no damage to the ancient structure. So instead, the team had to approach the underground space from the side, removing sand and debris by hand, centimeter by centimeter. Week after week, the team carefully worked their way toward the anomaly beneath the Treasury. Then, finally, they reached it. Cut directly into the bedrock were carved architectural stones. The radar had been right. There really was something beneath the Treasury. But what the researchers found inside would turn out to be far more extraordinary than simply another hidden chamber. 12 bodies, untouched. Most ancient tombs discovered at sites as famous as Petra have been disturbed long before archaeologists ever arrive. Either looters have gotten there first, or collapsing soil has shifted the bones. A completely undisturbed burial is rare. Finding one at Petra was unheard of, but this chamber had somehow survived. Inside were 12 human skeletons, and every one of them was still articulated, still intact. In archaeological terms, that meant the bones were still arranged almost exactly as they had been when the bodies were buried. Nothing had been scattered, nothing had been rearranged, nothing had been looted. There was no sign that anyone had broken into the chamber. For roughly 2,000 years, the dead had remained exactly where they were placed, and they weren't alone. Around the bodies, the team found bronze tools, iron implements, and ceramic vessels of different shapes and sizes. They weren't simply scattered across the floor. Many appeared to have been deliberately placed alongside the burials. Then one discovery made the entire scene feel surreal. One of the skeletons was still holding a ceramic vessel shaped exactly like a chalice. That would have been interesting enough on its own, but look at what was sitting directly above this tomb: the Treasury. For decades, that enormous facade had been associated with one of the most famous legends in movie culture. It was used as the fictional resting place of the Holy Grail in Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. Now, beneath that same building, archaeologists had found a real ancient burial with a cup that looked strikingly like a chalice. The resemblance was almost too perfect, but the objects told the researchers something more important than the Hollywood connection. The bronze and iron artifacts were remarkably well preserved. There was no sign of corrosion or rust. After 2,000 years underground, finding metal objects in this condition suggested that the chamber had remained exceptionally well sealed from the outside environment. The more closely archaeologists examined the chamber, the stranger it became. The researchers had not seen another Nabatean burial chamber at Petra, built in quite the same way. The bodies were unharmed, the objects were preserved, and as the researchers were finding out now, the chamber itself was also unusual. A tomb that breaks the pattern. The strange thing about the chamber wasn't just that it had survived intact. It was the way it had been built. The tomb had been divided internally by walls into separate sections. That was unusual. Most known burial chambers at Petra follow a relatively simple design. A single carved space, sometimes with niches or shelf-like sections cut into the walls for individual burials. This tomb was different. Geophysicist Richard Bates was working at the site. He described those internal walls in the tomb as one of the most puzzling parts of the entire discovery. The 12 people buried here had not simply been placed together in one open chamber. Someone had arranged the space around them in a very specific way. But there was another clue that made the mystery even more interesting. Preliminary dating placed the tomb somewhere between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, during the height of the Nabatean kingdom. That raised a possibility the researchers couldn't ignore. What if the tomb was older than the treasury above it? What if the burial chamber had already been here before the enormous facade was carved above it? The tomb may have been part of this location's significance from the beginning. If this theory turns out to be true, and the tomb is older than the treasury, think about all the possibilities that open up. The treasury is the most impressive structure of the entire Petra civilization. Historians have always thought that means it is also the most important structure of Petra. But if the tomb was built before the treasury, it could very well mean that this tomb is actually the most important place in Petra, and the treasury was made so that it was facing that tomb. If we had any records, any inscriptions, we would know what the real story was. That is, arguably, the most frustrating problem in all of Petra research. The Nabateans had left behind extraordinary monuments, sophisticated engineering, and some of the most impressive carved architecture in the ancient world. But they did not leave behind a single explanation of what it all meant. There was no inscription inside this tomb explaining why the 12 people had been separated. No surviving text described the ritual that took place here, and nothing definitively identified who these people were. That left the researchers with theories rather than answers. The people buried in the tomb could be members of the same family. Maybe they held a position of importance within Nabatean society. Or perhaps their connection was somehow related to whatever role the treasury itself once played, whether royal, religious, or something else. The chamber had told archaeologists everything it could. Now, it was time to move on to the bigger question. Who were the 12 people buried inside it? What the bones say. To uncover who these 12 people really were, researchers relied on two powerful scientific tools: DNA analysis and isotope analysis. The first question was the simplest. Were these people related? DNA could answer that. If several of them share close genetic relationships, the family tomb theory becomes much stronger. But if the genetic picture is scattered, researchers may be looking at something very different, people brought together because of their status, occupation, or connection to this place. Then there is another question DNA can't answer. Where did they actually live? That's where isotope analysis comes in. Chemical signatures preserved in teeth and bone can reveal clues about the environments a person grew up in and the foods they consumed. Suddenly, the 12 skeletons aren't just 12 bodies anymore. They're 12 biographies waiting to be reconstructed. There are two very distinct possibilities that the isotope analysis can reveal. Either the 12 people lived their entire lives in Petra, or they came here from different parts of the ancient world. And that is what makes this chamber so valuable. The tomb has not simply preserved 12 skeletons, it has preserved a rare, undisturbed snapshot of Nabatean life that can now be investigated. The answers aren't all in yet, but when the bones, DNA, and chemical evidence are finally put together, they may reveal something the walls of Petra never could. Not just how the Nabateans buried their dead, but who those people actually were. A city, still full of surprises. What makes this discovery so remarkable is how confident everyone had become that Petra had nothing left to reveal. And that's where the story becomes bigger than the 12 people inside the tomb. For more than 200 years, archaeologists have mapped, measured, excavated, and studied this city. Millions of visitors have walked through its streets, convinced they were seeing one of the ancient world's most thoroughly investigated sites. And all that time, a completely sealed tomb was sitting beneath one of its busiest courtyards. But Petra had already shown researchers that being heavily studied doesn't necessarily mean being fully understood. In 2016, archaeologist Sarah Parkak and her team used high-resolution satellite imagery to identify a massive structure buried beneath the desert floor in another part of Petra. The structure, roughly the size of an Olympic swimming pool, had never been properly documented from the ground. The technology was completely different from the ground-penetrating radar used in 2024. But the principle was surprisingly similar. One method looked from above, the other looked from ground level. Both revealed structures that had been invisible to people standing on the surface. And that distinction matters. Petra isn't simply a city filled with monuments that archaeologists have already catalogued. Much of the ancient settlement remains beneath layers of soil, stone, and centuries of accumulated history. Every new technology changes what researchers are capable of seeing. Satellite imagery can reveal shapes hidden beneath the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar can reveal spaces beneath the surface without disturbing them. Excavation can then turn those invisible signals into physical evidence. The Treasury tomb is what happened when those three stages finally came together. A structure that had been invisible became detectable. A hidden space became an excavation site, and an archaeological mystery became a group of 12 individuals whose lives can now be investigated in ways their discoverers could never have imagined. But finding the tomb was only the beginning. Once the chamber had been opened, the researchers were left with a much harder problem. They knew where these people had been buried. Now they had to figure out who they were, why they had been placed there, and what their burial could tell us about the society that built Petra. That is where the unanswered questions begin. The questions that remain. So who really were these 12 people? Scientists still can't answer that question with certainty. The DNA analysis may reveal whether they belong to the same family. Isotope analysis could show where they grew up and whether they spent their entire lives in Petra or traveled there from somewhere else. The bronze tools, iron objects, ceramic vessels, and other items buried alongside them may also reveal clues about their status, occupation, or role in Nabatean society. But perhaps the biggest mystery isn't about the people, it's about the place. Why was this chamber carved directly beneath the treasury? Was it built at the same time as the monument above it? Or was it already there before the treasury was carved into the cliff? If future dating confirms that the tomb is older than the treasury, it could completely change how archaeologists understand Petra. Instead of the treasury being the reason this location became important, the burial chamber itself may have been the reason the monument was built here in the first place. The discovery also proves something much bigger. Even after more than 200 years of exploration, Petra has not revealed all of its secrets. Researchers have mapped the city with drones, surveyed it using satellites, scanned it with ground-penetrating radar, and excavated it for generations. Yet one of the most remarkable tombs ever discovered remained hidden beneath one of the most visited places in the entire archaeological site. That changes the way archaeologists look at Petra. Instead of asking what has already been found, they are now asking what still lies beneath the ground. How many more sealed chambers remain undiscovered? How many more people are waiting to tell their stories? For nearly 2,000 years, this chamber remained untouched. Now, for the first time, science has the opportunity to uncover not only who these 12 people were, but also what their lives can teach us about one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries aren't the monuments standing in plain sight. They're the stories that have been waiting beneath them all along. After 2 centuries of investigation, researchers were convinced Petra had already told its entire story. But a tomb sealed for 2,000 years just proved that assumption wrong. And researchers are only just beginning to explain what they found. So, what do you think the real purpose of this tomb was? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next mystery we dig into. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.